When Jason asked me for a favor, I didn't think twice before saying yes. That's what best friends do. We help each other out. But if I had known how much that one favor would change everything, I might have hesitated. Maybe. My dad needs some help around the house, Jason had said, leaning back on my couch like it was his own. Just some small stuff. Fixing the fence, clearing out the garage. He won't ask, but he needs it. I had known Marcus for years. He was always the quiet, strong type, never saying more than necessary, but always polite. He was also built like someone who used to play sports. Broad shoulders, firm arms, the kind of man who looked like he could fix anything himself. But Jason was right. His dad had been through a lot. Ever since his mom passed away a couple of years ago, Marcus had been different. Quieter. Like he was carrying something too heavy for one person. I can do that, I said, shrugging. No problem. So that's how I found myself standing. In front of Jason's house, or rather, Marcus's house, on a Saturday morning, staring up at the place I'd visited so many times before. But this time, Jason wasn't with me. It was just me and Marcus. The door swung open before I could knock. Marcus stood there in a fitted t-shirt and jeans, his presence filling the doorway. He looked surprised, then gave a small nod. "Tyler," he said. "Didn't think you'd actually come," I smirked. "And let Jason call me unreliable for the rest of my life? No thanks." That got the smallest chuckle out of him, but it faded quickly. He stepped aside. "Come in." The house was quiet. Too quiet. It felt almost frozen in time, like nothing had changed since Jason's mom had been here. I was going to start with the fence, I said, trying to break the silence. Marcus nodded. "I'll grab some tools." Outside, the sun was already high, beating down as I worked on the wooden panels. Marcus joined me, barely saying a word. But his presence was solid, grounding. We worked in a rhythm, him holding the boards in place, me hammering them in. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of his forearm muscles tensing, the veins on his hands prominent under his tanned skin. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed before that he was an attractive man. But noticing and feeling something about it were two very different things. At one point, I wiped sweat from my forehead, sighing. Damn, it's hot. Marcus pulled off his shirt in response, tossing it onto a chair on the porch. "Tell me about it." I don't know why I looked longer than I should have. Maybe because I wasn't expecting it. Maybe because for the first time, we weren't just Jason's dad and Jason's best friend. It was just us. I stepped out of my car and took a deep breath, looking up at the house I'd been to 100 times before. But now, standing alone in the driveway, it felt different. There was something about the stillness, the way the air around it carried an unspoken weight. The place was well kept. Jason had mentioned that his dad took pride in maintaining it. But there was a quietness that made it feel almost frozen. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the windows spotless, but the absence of life was almost too noticeable. Before I could knock, the door opened, and there stood Marcus. He looked like he had just woken up, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his gray t-shirt stretched across his broad chest. He blinked at me, surprised, before his face settled into something unreadable. "Tyler," he said, his voice deep and even. "Didn't expect you this early." I shrugged. "Figured I'd get a head start. Hope that's okay." Marcus nodded and stepped aside, letting me in. The inside of the house was just like the outside. Tidy, organized, but eerily quiet. I glanced around, half expecting to see family pictures on the walls, but they were mostly bare. "Jason said the fence needed fixing?" I asked, eager to break the silence. Marcus exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, been meaning to get to it, just haven't had the time." I followed him outside to the backyard, where the wooden fence stood, some of the panels leaning awkwardly. Marcus handed me a toolbox, and we got to work. At first, we barely spoke. Marcus was efficient, focused, moving with the ease of a man who had done plenty of physical labor in his life. I matched his rhythm, handing him nails when he needed them, holding the boards in place while he secured them. I didn't notice the heat at first, But the midday sun was relentless. Sweat dripped down my back, my shirt sticking to me like a second skin. "Damn," I muttered, pulling at my collar. "It's brutal out here." Without a word, Marcus grabbed the hem of his shirt and pulled it over his head, tossing it onto the porch railing. I didn't mean to stare, but my eyes had a mind of their own. His body was exactly what I expected. Strong, toned in a way that spoke of years of discipline. But what caught me off guard was the way his skin gleamed under the sunlight, the sharp lines of his collarbones, the dusting of hair on his chest that trailed down his stomach. I looked away quickly, swallowing hard. This wasn't the first time I had seen a man shirtless, but something about this moment felt different. Like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. Marcus didn't seem to notice my sudden awkwardness. He kept working, hammering nails into place, the muscles in his arms flexing with each movement. "Hand me that next piece," he said, gesturing toward a loose board. I reached for it at the same time he did. Our fingers brushed. It was nothing. A split second of contact, but for some reason, it sent a jolt through me, a sharp awareness that I didn't understand. I expected him to pull away quickly, but he didn't. Neither did I. When I finally looked up, Marcus was watching me. Not in a way that felt strange, but in a way that made my pulse quicken. His eyes lingered just a second too long before he cleared his throat and shifted back, taking the board from my hand. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. I nodded, pretending. I wasn't overanalyzing every second of what had just happened. We kept working, but something between us had shifted. I wasn't sure what it was, but I could feel it. After a couple of hours, Marcus finally stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That should hold for now," he said, nodding at the newly reinforced fence. I exhaled, stretching my arms. "I think we earned a break." Marcus gave a small chuckle. "Yeah, I guess we did. You drink beer?" I hesitated for half a second. "Yeah, sure." He motioned for me to follow him up to the porch, where he pulled 2 cold bottles from a cooler. He popped the caps off effortlessly, handing one to me before sinking into one of the chairs. I sat beside him, letting the slight breeze cool the sweat off my skin. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just sipped our drinks, staring out at the yard like 2 men who had spent years doing this together, even though we never had. Marcus was the first to break the silence. "Jason tells me you're finishing up school soon." "Yeah," I said, rolling the bottle between my hands. "Feels weird. Spent all these years thinking college would help me figure out what I wanted to do, but I still don't have a clue." Marcus smirked slightly. "I think that's normal." "What about you?" I asked, glancing at him. "Did you always know what you wanted?" He exhaled, eyes distant. "When I was younger, I thought I had everything figured out. Got married young, started a family, built a life. Then, things change, and you realize there's no roadmap for any of it." I didn't need to ask what he meant. Everyone knew how much he loved his wife. Her sudden passing had left a hole in the family that no one could quite fill, not even Jason. Marcus took another sip of his beer, staring ahead. "It's been a while now, but some days the house still feels too big, too quiet." I wasn't sure what to say to that. I wasn't good at deep conversations, and I didn't want to say something meaningless like, "I'm sorry." Instead, I just nodded, letting the weight of his words settle between us. After a moment, I spoke without really thinking. "I get that, in a way. Not the loss, but the quiet, the loneliness." Marcus turned his head slightly, giving me a curious look. You're young, got your whole life ahead of you." I let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, and somehow I still feel like I don't fit anywhere. I've dated, but nothing ever really sticks. It's like I'm always looking for something, but I don't know what." He studied me for a long moment, as if seeing me differently for the first time. "That's a hard place to be." "Yeah," I admitted. It is. For a while, we just sat there, the sounds of distant birds and rustling trees filling the space between us. It should have been a casual conversation, just two people talking about life, but something about it felt deeper than that. Maybe it was the way Marcus looked at me, like he actually understood what I was saying. Or maybe it was the way the air felt heavier, thicker, as if something unspoken was hanging there between us. Some point, our eyes met, really met. It was just a second, maybe two, but it was long enough for my stomach to tighten, long enough for my breath to hitch just slightly. I looked away first. Took a sip of my beer, even though I wasn't thirsty. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I liked sitting here with Marcus more than I should. The sky had been clear all afternoon, but by the time the sun started setting, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees in the yard. Dark clouds rolled in fast, swallowing the last bit of daylight, and the distant rumble of thunder made it clear that I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "You should stay," Marcus said, glancing out the window. "Storm's gonna get bad. Roads flood out here when it rains like this." I hesitated, even though I knew he was right. "You sure? I don't want to impose," Marcus scoffed lightly. "I'm not sending you out in this. You'll stay." There was a finality in his voice, like he had already decided for me. Something about that made my stomach tighten, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me hyper-aware of everything. The quiet house, the fact that it was just the two of us, the way Marcus's presence filled the space so effortlessly. We ended, up in the kitchen, throwing together a simple dinner with whatever he had in the fridge. Nothing fancy, some grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, but the process of making it together felt easy, natural. "You actually know how to cook?" I teased, stirring the vegetables in the pan. Marcus smirked. "What, you thought I lived off takeout?" "I mean, kinda." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I had to learn. Can't have Jason thinking I'm completely useless." That made me laugh, and the sound filled the house in a way that felt unfamiliar, even to me. I realized then that I had never really heard much laughter here, not since Jason's mom passed. Maybe Marcus hadn't either. After dinner, Marcus grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, pouring us both a drink. He moved to the living room, flipping through his record collection, finally settling on something old and smooth. The sound of a deep, bluesy voice filled the space, blending with the steady rhythm of rain hitting the windows. I leaned back on the couch, the warmth of the drink settling in my chest. "Didn't peg you as a music guy." Marcus sat down beside me, close, but not too close. "There's a lot you don't know about me." I don't know if it was the storm outside, the drinks, or just the quiet intimacy of the moment, but the air between us felt different, charged. At some point, I got up to grab the dishes from the table. Marcus stood at the same time, reaching for the same plate. Our hands touched. It should have been nothing. Just an accidental brush of fingers, but neither of us moved. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The warmth of his skin against mine was a slow, burning fire, and the room suddenly felt too small, too hot. I looked up, and Marcus was watching me, his expression unreadable. His hand stayed there, resting against mine, like he was waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. Neither did he. Something passed between us, something silent but undeniable. It wasn't just a touch. It was a shift, a moment that neither of us could ignore, no matter how much we wanted to. Finally, Marcus exhaled, his fingers curling just slightly before he pulled back. He cleared his throat, looking away. "We should, finish cleaning up," he muttered. "Yeah," I said quickly, turning back to the dishes, pretending my hands weren't still tingling. Neither of us said anything else about it, but we both felt it. We moved around the kitchen in near silence, the only sounds coming from the clinking of dishes and the occasional roll of thunder outside. But the quiet wasn't the same as before. It was thick, charged, like something unspoken was pressing down on us, waiting to be acknowledged. I wasn't sure if Marcus was avoiding looking at me, or if I was the one avoiding him. Maybe it was both. As I dried the last plate, Marcus leaned against the counter, watching me. His expression was softer than usual, almost thoughtful. "You know," he said after a moment, "this house hasn't felt this alive in a long time." I turned to face him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "You bring a certain energy," he continued, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass absent-mindedly. "Laughter, something I didn't realize I missed." His words sent warmth through me, settling somewhere deep in my chest. I swallowed, feeling a sudden rush of boldness, maybe from the whiskey, maybe from the way his eyes lingered on me just a little too long. "I've been feeling strange all day," I admitted, setting the plate down. "Being here with you, talking, working together. It's different. I didn't expect to feel this way." Marcus didn't look away. He didn't brush it off or pretend not to understand. His jaw tensed slightly, like he was weighing something heavy in his mind. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," he said quietly. "Years, maybe." His voice was raw, hesitant, but there was no mistaking what he meant. I took a slow step closer, my heart pounding. "So it's not just me." Marcus exhaled, his gaze flicking to my lips for just a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. "No," he murmured. "It's not just you. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did." One moment, there was space between us, and the next, I felt his breath on my skin, warm and uncertain, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, hesitant, like neither of us could fully believe we were doing this. Like we were testing the weight of something fragile, something we weren't ready to name. His lips were firm but soft. His touch steady as his fingers ghosted over my jaw, grounding me in the moment. I kissed him back, letting myself sink into the quiet electricity between us. The warmth, the unspoken understanding. When we finally pulled away, it was as if the air had been knocked from my lungs. We stared at each other, breathing heavily, reality settling in around us. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Tyler, I know," I whispered. "I know." We didn't have answers. We didn't know what this meant, but we knew something had changed. And there was no going back. I woke up before the sun had fully risen, the soft gray light filtering through the guest room window. My body was still heavy with sleep, but my mind was already racing. The kiss. The way Marcus had looked at me. The warmth of his hands. The way my heart had pounded against my ribs, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I ran a hand over my face, exhaling slowly. Was it a mistake? I didn't feel like it was, but the weight of it, the uncertainty of what it meant, sat heavy in my chest. I pulled on my shirt and padded quietly toward the kitchen, where I could already hear movement. Marcus was there, standing by the coffee maker, dressed in his usual worn-in jeans and a plain black t-shirt. If he was feeling the same turmoil I was, he didn't show it. He looked calm, collected, like nothing had happened at all. "Morning," he said simply, pouring a cup of coffee. "Morning," I echoed, unsure of what else to say. He slid a mug toward me without meeting my eyes. I wrapped my hands around, the warmth, watching the steam curl into the air. For a few minutes, we just stood there, sipping in silence. The same silence from last night, but different now. Thicker, heavier. Was he avoiding talking about it? Did he regret it? I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words felt tangled in my throat. "I should probably head out soon," I finally muttered, setting my mug down. Marcus's grip tightened around his cup, his knuckles going white for just a second before. He set it down too. "Tyler!" I turned, already halfway to the door, but his voice made me stop. He wasn't looking at me, not fully, but there was something tense in the way he stood, like he was fighting some internal battle. Finally, he met my eyes. "Before you go, we should talk," I swallowed, my pulse kicking up. Yeah, I said quietly. We should. I wasn't sure what he was going to say. I wasn't sure what I wanted him to say. But I knew one thing. Last night had changed everything. And whatever. This was between us. It wasn't over. Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You know we can't. He stopped, exhaling sharply. Jason can't know about this. I flinched at his words, even though I had been thinking the same thing. I know, I admitted, running a hand through my hair. But that doesn't make it any easier. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. You think this is easy for me. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. So, what are you saying? That last night didn't mean anything. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for the first time there was something raw in his eyes. I'm saying it can't mean anything. The words hit like a punch to the gut. I looked away, trying to steady myself, but the weight of it all was pressing down on me. Jason had been my best friend for years. He trusted me, and here I was, tangled up in something with his father. Something I hadn't seen coming. Something I didn't know how to walk away from. You're worried about what he'd think, I said quietly. Marcus nodded. Aren't you? Of course I was. If Jason found out, everything could change. But what about us? I looked up at Marcus, searching his face for something, anything, to tell me that he wasn't just pushing me away out of fear. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, looking as conflicted as I felt. Maybe it's best if we keep our distance. The words were logical, reasonable, but they felt wrong. I scoffed, shaking my head. Is that really what you want? Silence stretched between us. Marcus didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. His eyes told me everything. No, it wasn't what he wanted, but that didn't mean he'd let himself have it. The days that followed were torture. I went through the motions, class, work, hanging out with Jason, but my mind kept drifting back to Marcus, to the way he had looked at me that morning, to the way his lips had felt against mine. I told myself to let it go, to respect his decision, but I couldn't. So one evening, when I knew Jason wouldn't be home, I found myself standing in front of Marcus's door, my heart hammering. When he opened it, I could tell he hadn't expected to see me. His expression flickered with surprise. Then something else. Something I couldn't quite name. Tyler. His voice was rough, hesitant. I exhaled. I can't do this. He frowned, slightly. Do what? Pretend like nothing happened. Marcus looked away, his jaw clenching. Tyler. No. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. I know it's complicated. I know Jason might not understand, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, and I don't think you can either. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You don't get it, he muttered. If this goes wrong, then we deal with it, I cut in. Together. His eyes met mine, full of conflict, of hesitation. But beneath it all, there was something else. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, Marcus stepped forward. He cupped my face, his thumb brushing over my jaw, his touch both careful and certain. You're not making this easy, he murmured. I swallowed. Good. And then he kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was deep, slow, full of unspoken promises. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I melted into him, feeling every inch of the tension that had built between us over the past few days. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine. If we do this, we have to be careful. I nodded. We will be. Marcus searched my eyes for a moment longer, before finally exhaling. Okay, he whispered, and just like that, the decision was made. A week later, We met at a small restaurant, on the edge of town, someplace quiet, out of the way. Neither of us had said it out loud, but we both knew why we chose it. Marcus was already at the table when I arrived, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his glass. He looked up when I walked in, and for a brief second, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. But then I smiled, and he smiled back. I slid into the seat across from him, the candlelight between us casting a soft glow over his face. It felt surreal, sitting here like this, just the two of us. No fences to fix, no storm raging outside, just us. This is different, Marcus said, his voice low, thoughtful. Yeah, I admitted, but not bad. He exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. No, not bad. We talked over dinner, but it wasn't just about the food or the weather. It was about this, about what we were doing, about how things wouldn't be easy, but neither of us wanted to walk away. At one point, our hands brushed on the table. Neither of us pulled away. As I sat there, watching Marcus, this man I never expected to see in this way, I thought about how it all started. A simple favor, helping a friend's dad. And somehow it had led me here, to something I never saw coming, but couldn't imagine letting go. Maybe it wasn't conventional, maybe it was messy, but it was ours, and for now, that was enough.